Hello, welcome to our webinar for today. The topic for this discussion is going to be employees versus independent contractors. So we're going to be talking a little bit of a in-depth dive into what it takes to hire an employee, how to make a determination as to whether it should be a W-2 employee or a 1099 contractor. We'll also go through some tips for employers. This is all on the employer side, as far as what to do to protect yourself when hiring individuals, either as contractors or employees, and then what responsibilities that the employer has when you do that. So just a little bit about, let's see, a little bit about myself. Get to the next slide here. I am the current president for the Southeast chapter of the U.S. Pan-Asian Chamber of Commerce, Pan-Asian American Chamber of Commerce. Been in this role, this is my third year, and I'm also an attorney by profession. I handle all sorts of disputes and contracts between small businesses and just try to help companies get off the ground and then help them as they grow with employment issues, with buying and selling of businesses, commercial real estate, and then we also do some litigation. So well versed in this area of law and kind of the pitfalls of what could go wrong and how to prevent those things going wrong before they happen. The U.S. Pan-Asian American Chamber of Commerce has been around for almost 40 years, and they have been very instrumental in helping small businesses. I mean, that's their goal. Especially Asian small businesses, helping them get off the ground and giving them the tools to succeed, not only within the realms that they already are accustomed to, but also taking that next step to make connections with government entities, local, state, and federal, as well as larger corporations so that they can catapult themselves up to higher and bigger deals, bigger contracts, and be more successful. All right, so we're going to start out with how do we figure out kind of what kind of employee we want, or what kind of employee we have. Sometimes it can be both ways. So are we looking for a certain type of employee, or do we have one now we need to categorize how they're going to be? So a couple things to look at. One is behavioral, right? So I'll give you an example. So let's say you have an office space and you're an IT company, but you need to hire somebody to do electric work in your office. There's something wrong, some sockets need to be fixed, some light fixtures need to be installed, something. The person you hire to do that is most likely going to be a contractor, a 1099 contractor, because they're going to come when they're available, and they're going to come for a limited time, limited scope, and they're going to do what they are good at doing, and they're going to complete that task and be done with it. They are not dictated by you as far as certain amount of hours that they need to put in or a certain amount of deliverables that they need to put in over a period of time. You don't control their scheduling. You don't control exactly how they behave when they're here. So those kind of people are kind of, and it's very short term, right? They're only here for a specific project and then they leave. So those would definitely be, and I'm giving you two extremes. So those kind of employees are definitely contractor employees. The other extreme is going to be a person that you hire that you need to be at the office from 9 to 5. They need to log in. They need to, conduct themselves with XYZ expectations. They're bound by your employee handbook. They need to abide by rules and regulations of your company. You dictate what they need to do during the time that they're here. And, you're in charge of their schedule and what they do and what they need to complete in a given day. Those are employees. Financial also. So with a contractor situation, they are typically their own entity or they're responsible for filing their own taxes. So if you pay somebody, let's say for some kind of electrical work, you're going to pay them a lump sum of $1,000. Well, at the end of the day, they would be responsible for paying tax on that $1,000. You are not going to be responsible for paying tax on that money. Whereas with an employee, if they work for a week and you pay them $1,000, you are required to deduct from there the state deductions, the federal deductions, and you have to add on to your employer tax and pay all that to the government, either federal, local, whatever the case may be. So a little bit different treatment. And then as far as relationship too, With a contractor, you're typically, it's like a smaller scope, right? Complete project XYZ by this date, but you can do it at your convenience, whenever you feel like it, or day and night, whenever you want to work, you just need to get it done. Like for an electrical contractor, he may have to come in 3 different days at 3 different times to get something done. But you're not telling him he has to be here between 9 and 12 for the next 3 days and complete XYZ. Whereas if an employee, you're going to tell them you need to be here, 9 to 5, going forward, and these are your deliverables. So it's a little bit different. There are some gray areas, and we can kind of get into that as we talk about it more. But for the most part, there's kind of 2 different sets of these things. Now, a lot of people try to categorize those who should be employees as 1099 contractors. And they do it because they think they can save on taxes. But it's not the right way to categorize them. The IRS could come back after you and say these are not properly designated, and then come back and penalize you for not withholding taxes and doing it properly. Here's just some basic examples of ones that the IRS has clearly specified as not contract employees. And those would be like paralegals, for example. For the most part, paralegals have to be hourly and they have to be employees. You can't pay them like a salary. You can't pay them like a lump sum. There's lots of little regulations. And so if you're not clear if your particular type of employee falls into those, then you should definitely consult an accountant or an attorney to kind of help you categorize them from the get-go, so you have the right type of taxing and reporting and all that done from the initial phases. Okay, so I talked about some of the obligations. So with an employee, the obligations are hefty. There's lots of things that the employer has to do, and it's cumbersome. It takes time, takes a lot of energy. And if you don't have your system set up, you're setting yourself for failure. I've seen a lot of companies get taxed excessively because of late fees and interest and penalties because they just failed to file stuff. They didn't know they had to file it. They were late. They didn't have the proper paperwork in place. And so it snowballs. Like once you don't get one filing done, it just keeps adding and it gets worse and worse. So advice is for most small companies is once you're going to start payroll, make sure you have a good accountant on your side, or a payroll servicing company, or somebody who can advise you as to what your obligations are as an employer. But just kind of as a overview, you've got 3 different entities that you typically report to. One is your local Department of Revenue. Second is going to be your local Department of Labor. And the third is going to be the IRS department, the Treasury Department. And with each of these, there's all sorts of filings that are required. Every state is a little bit different. I can speak to Georgia because that's where I'm based, but for the Department of Revenue, you're going to do monthly withholdings. So for every paycheck that you cut to an employee, let's say it's $1,000 for that paycheck, I'm just using round numbers to make it easy, you may have to deduct X amount, maybe $1,200 or sorry, maybe a couple $100 for state and federal taxes that the employee is contributing to their tax liability. At the same time, you're going to have to then add on your employer taxes and then file it with the respective government authorities. So you've got monthly withholdings from the payroll. Then you've got monthly deposits on both the state and federal level. So you've got to take those deposits and then kind of leave it with the state and federal government until you do the quarterly filings where it all gets accounted for. And then there's quarterly filings. And then there's also year-end filings, such as like a W-2 reporting and W-3 statements, all sorts of things like that, where you're telling the federal government, here are all the employees I had for the year, here are all their total payrolls, and here's copies of all their W-2s that I'm going to be sending them at the end of the year. And all that gets documented, and then it gets linked with those employees so that when they file their taxes, it all matches up. Same with the Department of Labor. There's like monthly withholdings, and then there's going to be monthly filings as well. With the IRS, there are monthly withholdings, monthly deposits, and then you've got something called quarterly 941 filings, which is kind of a snapshot of all your monthly deposits that you've made, as well as kind of a capture of how many employees you had and what you paid and what your total tax liability is and all that. And then the yearly is self-explanatory, but it's like all the 941s put together for a yearly report at the end of the year. So all this stuff, it seems burdensome, and it is, especially if you don't know what you're doing. So my advice is to definitely get an accountant involved early on, so that your systems are set up well. So you can focus on what you're good at and let the accountants deal with all this, back end stuff with the employees or your HR department, or, it depends on how large you are. And how much resources you have, but at the very least have an accountant or payroll service that deals with some of this stuff. On the flip side, for as far as independent contractors, the paperwork is far less cumbersome, much easier. But like I said, you can't just arbitrarily designate people as W-9 or 1099 employees, especially if you have control over how they need to perform, when they need to come to the office, things like that. Those are employees, and you do need to withhold taxes. You need to file all those things. It's one of the things that you got to do as, if you've got an employee. For 1099 contractors, typically you should collect a W-9 statement from them, and that is a document. It's like a one-pager. And it just has their name, address, and either social security number or tax ID number. And that's because at the end of the year, you have to file something called a 1099, which is a 1099 non-employee compensation form, similar to a W-2, but a 1099 NEC is what documents how much you've paid to that individual over the course of a year. And as far as I know, for right now, anything paid over $600 to an individual or a contractor needs to be reported to the IRS on this 1099 NEC form. And the contractor will get a copy at the end of the year. Actually, it's like July or January 31st, I believe, after the end of the previous year. So you got 30 days to kind of wrap everything up, get your numbers together, and then you have to deliver it to them so that they have time to then file their taxes. And then IRS gets a copy of it as well. So reporting requirements are much lower, but you do need to make sure and get that W-9 ahead of time, because when it comes tax time, it'll be too hard to track those people down to get that stuff. So you want to get it on the front end. All right, we're going to switch gears a little bit here to kind of the hiring process. So a lot of these employees and employers, whether they be 1099 contractors or employees, the background information is somewhat similar. Anytime as an employer you're bringing somebody on to your place of work, you want to kind of check up on them, right? You want to do your due diligence. And nowadays you've got Google, you can definitely Google them. That's probably a good start anyway, to see if there's any red flags. But do a background check, especially if there is sensitive data that these employees are going to be handling. You want to do a background check as far as financial situation. You can order their credit report. You can order a criminal record report, and you can ask them to get it. Or you can have them authorize you to obtain it. Either way, there's lots of services that do this, but you do need authorization if you're going to go and get it on their behalf. You can also get them to take a drug test. Again, it depends on kind of the position and, what these employees are going to be doing. And if you are going to be hiring a contractor, and it's kind of, if it's a type of job that requires some kind of insurance, you should definitely check in on that. Like, for example, if you're hiring a contractor, like a plumber, or somebody who's going to start ripping down your walls and doing construction work, you want to make sure that they're insured. Because if something were to go wrong, you have someone to go after. Same with like E&O insurance, which is like errors and emissions insurance. Those are carried, that type of insurance is carried by more like professional types of folks. If they're doing a particular financial service for you or something that requires insurance, you can certainly ask them for it. Ask them for a copy and keep it on file. And then for employees, this is separate. Well, let's talk about two different kinds of employment contracts. So one is real simple. For the contractor, you probably want a contract, and it's not meant. This slide is talking more about a W-2 employee. But as far as a contractor's agreement, you can definitely have an agreement with a contractor, and you should just lay out the kind of basics, right? What is your expectation? What are they supposed to complete for you? By when it should be completed? How much you're supposed to pay them? When it's supposed to get paid? And then maybe confirming that there's no liens that would be filed against your property, or what happens if somebody breaches. What are the remedies? Do they get their money back, or do you get your money back, or do they have to complete the job, or I mean, there's all sorts of things that you could come up with, but something should be captured in writing as far as what the expectations are, because too often it ends up being he said, she said, I thought, but and then that turns into litigation. It's not worth it. A little bit of time spent up front kind of documenting what you expect out of that contractor and what you've agreed to pay if they complete those expectations goes a very long way. And the more detailed you are, the better, especially with timing and deliverables. And a lot of times I would say that you can break it up. You don't have to pay it all at once. So there should be, a timeline. When X gets done, you get X amount. And along the way, that gives you a lot more control over how things are getting paid, and making sure each of those things are done accurately before you start paying all the money, and then you have no recourse when you find out later on that it wasn't done properly. As far as employment contracts, so a lot of states are at will employees, so which means if you hire somebody, they're allowed to leave whenever, and you can fire them for any reason. You don't always have to have cause, but you can't have some of the protected. There are certain areas that are protected, certain classes that are protected if you have more than X amount of employees, and it depends. Again, state and federal regulations constantly change on this, but in general, employees can leave when they want, and you can fire them when you want. You don't have to have reason. They don't have to have reason, but there are certain situations when you can have an employment contract, and you may want to agree to certain terms, certain promises from the employee, and in return they get XYZ. So things to include in those kind of employment contracts is the length of it. Sometimes maybe you find a really good manager and you could do a contract with them and say, hey, if you can stay for 3 years, I can pay you XYZ, and at the end of these 3 years I can give you XYZ. Those things could be profit sharing, they could be stock options, they could be an increase in salary, it could be bonus, all sorts of things can be contracted. But if they leave before a certain amount of time or whatever, then they maybe forfeit those benefits. So you could, figure out contracts and things like that with employees. But again, it should have kind of what happens if somebody breaches, what are the repercussions for each side if somebody breaches that contract, whether it be the employer letting that employee go or the employee quitting before that contract term is over. Something else to keep in mind when you hire an employee, the company that you're hiring for, whether it's a small company or a large company, there are usually some rules and regulations that you'd like the employees to abide by. So, it's important to have some kind of employee handbook so that an employee knows what the expectations of the company are. I mean, certainly you can have an orientation, you can tell them, but this kind of written documentation goes a long way in case they have a question or it's not clear. They have somewhere to refer back to. And the things that the employee handbook should have is kind of the company's rules, what the expectations are on a day-to-day basis, as far as could be dress code, what time they're expected to be here, how they're supposed to clock in, how they're supposed to clock out, how are they supposed to report their time to the employer or HR department. What are holidays are days off in the company, or are they paid or unpaid? What is the vacation policy? How much vacation can an employee take, and what is the procedure for asking for those days off? Or are they automatic, or things like that? Or sick policy. If somebody is sick, how many sick days do they have, or how much leave do they have for family emergencies and things like that? And then overall, like, HR procedure. If there's a question, how does an employee go about addressing it, or dealing with an issue if they've got an issue with another employee or with payroll or something to that effect. So these are all things that can be neatly kind of organized in the book. It doesn't have to be specific for everything. Like, for example, one employee may have more vacation time than the other, but the procedure for how to request vacation time should probably be the same everywhere. So those kind of things need to be constant. And this book can be, updated all the time. It's not a big deal. But when you do create the book, you should have an employee sign off saying they've received it and have read it, because that gives you confirmation that, okay, they know what the rules are. they're expected to abide by it. Now you can hold them accountable to those rules. To create the employee handbook, there's actually a really good, just basic level handbook available on the SBA's website. I've used it several times for employees, and it's a good starting point because it has like all the different categories that you can possibly think of. And then you can adjust and delete as you need, but it's a really good starting point to kind of address all the different issues that could come up in your workplace. Okay. Couple of other types of agreements that may be of benefit when you hire employees. So one is the confidentiality agreement. A lot of times businesses have information that's confidential, that's private, that you don't want leaked around outside of your office, outside of your business, to competitors or otherwise. And so when this is an agreement that you should have maybe a contractor and an employee sign when they initiate work with you. And it could just be like, it's usually like a quick 2-3 page document, but it talks about how long that confidential agreement is good for, usually for the term that they're working plus X amount of years after. And then what content is deemed confidential. Not everything you touch is confidential, but if it's marked confidential, or if it contains sales figures or financial data or employee information, or it could be client personal information, or there's lots of different categories, but you have to kind of specify what is it that's confidential. And it can't be something that can be found in the public realm, right? So if I Google like an address of a company, and if it's public knowledge, well, that doesn't qualify as confidential then. So, there's parameters of what's confidential. And then what happens if the employee or the contractor doesn't abide by that? So what are the employer's, remedies? Like what can they do? So one is injunctive relief. You can ask a court or other authority to have them stop doing that act of sharing confidential information or doing whatever that's in violation of the agreement. Or you can impose some kind of financial liability on them or something like that based on the harm. So there's there's lots of different ways on how to protect the employer on that. And then the last one I thought would be important for employees, as far as an additional agreement that you bring on with either a contractor or an employee, is a non-compete agreement. So, for example, let's say you have a company that sells some kind of personalized awards, okay, like things that people give out in companies for awards or like knickknacks and things like that. And you own a company like this, and you have some trademark on, on your logo, and you also have a huge list of clients that come to you every year during the holidays or during maybe it's their annual gatherings or retreats or what, and they place orders with you. So you have this list of all these people that year to year give you business. What happens if somebody takes that list and goes to a competitor and leaves you and takes the list with you, right? So with them. So that's huge, right? That's your entire business that just went out the door. So you've got to have something called a non-compete. And that prevents an employee from leaving your company and going to a competitor within X amount of time and X amount of distance. And it has to be, the non-compete rules, at least in Georgia, are pretty strict. And I would imagine in most jurisdictions. But two of the basic things that must be covered in a non-compete clause is it must be reasonable as to space and time. So you can't say that an employee can't go to a competitor in the entire world for 20 years. It's not reasonable. That person could never go work again, doing with the knowledge that they have. So it's got to be reasonable. If you've got like an accounting practice and you don't want your employee to go to the accounting firm down the road, well, that's fair. You can say within maybe a 10 or 15 mile radius, because most of your clientele is in your community. And you can say for 2 years, right? Because that gives you enough headway where they can go and establish themselves somewhere else without competing with your clients, and you can make sure and solidify your client base and make sure that you have control over it. So those specifications, as far as a couple years and X amount of miles that are reasonable, are enforceable. If you have something where it's like in the entire world forever, it's not enforceable. So even if it looks good on paper and you think you've got like the best deal ever with this employee can never compete with you on the planet, it does you no good if it's not enforceable. And so at the end of the day, you want to make sure that the non-competes are there. They're signed by um, contractors and employees, but they have to be reasonable to protect you. So, you have to define kind of the time limit, the space, and what is competition. They can't work for any company that's even in the realm of yours, but it has to be somebody that does the same thing, or like for, let's say you've got like a very specific restaurant that offers a specific type of cuisine, and you don't want somebody competing with you for catering contracts. And you can say, well, this person can't go work for this type of restaurant within a 10-mile radius for 2 years. That's probably enforceable, because they've got some know-how as far as, who your client base is, where you're getting your catering contracts, how you've been able to procure them and keep them. And you don't want somebody taking that knowledge and going somewhere else and then competing directly with you. So those things are fair, and are enforceable, and they should be done on the get-go. Now, one quick caveat on that: you can't have somebody work for you for like 10 years and then say, "Oh, by the way, I need you to sign this non-compete, or I'm going to fire you." It's really hard to have something like that enforceable because now there's no new consideration for them to sign that agreement. And it's kind of a one-way road. And so courts don't look kindly on that kind of stuff. So best to get it done on the front end when you first hire as a condition to employment. Because if you try to sneak it in later on, there is definitely going to be a question as to whether it's enforceable or not. So I hope this kind of helps as far as an overview of lots of different issues that come up in the employee world, as far as how to engage an employee or contractor, what things to look at as far as whether they're 1099 or W-2 employee, and then the onboarding process. What all do you need to get from them? What are your responsibilities as a employer, both with a W-2 employee and a 1099 contractor? And then just getting your systems in place, with any additional agreements you need them to sign. Like, for example, with a W-2 employee, you're going to have them sign a W-4 form, maybe an I-9 to make sure that they have status in the United States before they can work. And then you want to maybe put in the confidentiality agreement. You want to have a non-compete agreement if it's something that is important to you, and also the employee handbook. So you probably have like a whole package of things that you want these employees to sign up on before they actually start working. So this is like the onboarding process, but there should be some process, because that way, if you have all this set, you can grow faster, you can grow without trouble, and you can really focus on the things that are important in your business. Like anything, the background and the structural components of a business are extremely important. So this is just one aspect. Hopefully, this is very helpful to you, and hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you very much.